I do have some problems with Pokemon games in the past, but I'll tell you right now that the Legendaries are not one of those problems. For the most part, Game Freak has done a magnificent job with them, and I'm fully expecting that to continue. Even still, I thought it would be good to share some ideas I have on what Game Freak needs to do with the Sun and Moon Legendaries. Also, I'll only be discussing the Legendaries for Sun and Moon, and not the hypothetical third member of the Legendary Trio. If we even get a Legendary Trio, that is. Anyways, without further ado, here's what Game Freak needs to do to make the Sun and Moon Legendaries picture perfect. To begin with, the Legendaries should have typings that balance out with one another. Specifically, I want both Legendaries to be dual typed, where for each Legendary, one of their typings is weak to one of the other Legendaries' typings, while the other is strong against one of the other Legendaries' typings. So for instance, Fire Dark and Water Psychic would be typings that balance one another out. The reason I say this is I would rather not have one of the Legendaries be directly weak to the other, as was the case in X and Y or Generation 3. Also, on the topic of typing, I personally don't want to see another Dragon-type Legendary, since we've had way too many Dragon-type Legendaries in the past, and I'm a little bit sick of it. If Game Freak can address these 2 points with regards to typing, I think it would help a lot to improve the Legendaries in Sun and Moon. The next thing I would like for the Legendaries is capture rates of 3 as opposed to 45. This is something comparatively minor, but I still want it to happen. Game Freak, for God's sake, make it hard for us to catch the Legendaries again. The whole point of Legendary Pokemon is they have superior stats in exchange for being very difficult to catch. I understand what Game Freak is trying to do, since the Legendaries have been more directly involved in the story in the past 2 generations, so they don't want to make it too hard to catch them. But personally, I say they need to throw that out the window. Some of my best memories as a kid are struggling catching Pokemon like Zapdos, Mewtwo, and Groudon. So I'd really like nothing more than for Game Freak to go back to that. Another thing the ideal Legendaries should have is very epic and useful signature moves. A clarification, this is more of a returning feature since Pokemon has generally done a great job with this. Oblivion Wing and Geomancy were awesome moves for Gen 6, and Origin Pulse as well as Precipice Blades were pretty badass as well. Game Freak needs to continue to put a lot of thought into the exclusive moves for the Legendaries and their movesets in general for Sun and Moon. Another idea I'd like to suggest, which is perhaps a bit of a stretch feature, is it would be cool if the Legendaries each had 2 signature moves. One specifically for stat boosting, and the other specifically for attacking. For example, under this setup, Xerneas would have Geomancy as its stat boosting move, as well as some other exclusive Fairy type move that deals damage. Along the same lines, I'd like for the Legendary Pokemon in Sun and Moon to have slightly more interesting abilities than in previous games. I feel like for the past few generations, the Legendary's abilities have been very lackluster. For instance, Dialga and Palkia's abilities in Pressure were horrendously generic choices. Zekrom and Reshiram are great Pokemon, but Terravolt and Turbo Blaze are literally a copy-paste of Mold Breaker, but with a different name. Fairy and Dark Aura weren't nearly as bad, but just powering up Dark and Fairy type moves isn't really the most revolutionary thing. It would be great if the Legendaries got something more creative for their abilities in the same vein as say Stance Change or Protean. The abilities for the Sun and Moon Legendaries should help define their unique identity and play a very major role in battle, as was the case back in Generation 3. One more thing I'd like to see for the Legendaries, and this is one of the most important items, is I want for them to have multiple forms. Whether this is a primal evolution or a different form in the same way as Kyurem doesn't really matter to me. The main thing I want to see is for these things to have different forms that also have reasonably different stats and play styles so that we have different ways of using them. Moreover, changing forms should not require the Legendary to hold an item, as was the case with Giratina. Instead, to change the Legendaries, we should have to go through some sort of process that is both convenient and reversible. So something along the lines of changing Rotom's form in past games. I think multiple forms for the Legendaries is a great idea, and it worked out really well with Primal Groudon and Kyogre, as well as Kyurem to some extent. And it would definitely be great to see something like that in Sun and Moon. Finally, to round things out, I've got a couple of design related things. Unfortunately, whether one likes it or not, design tends to be very personal, so this might get a bit subjective here. And if that's the case, I apologize. Anyways, the first thing I want to see is a good color scheme. Game Freak has had some Legendaries in the past that in my opinion haven't had the best combination of colors. For instance, I love Regirock, but its colors, which are just different shades of brown, are really plain. Zygarde is another Pokemon I like quite a bit, but at the same time I'm not the biggest fan of the black and green coloring, especially given that its typing is Dragon and Ground, and those two just don't match up. Reshiram and Zekrom are two more Pokemon that once again I like, but the pure black and pure white color schemes are just a little bit too simplistic in my opinion. On the other hand, some examples of great color combinations are Xerneas, Yveltal, Dialga, Giratina, and Rayquaza, to name just a few. Ideally, the Legendaries should have two primary colors, as well as perhaps one more minor color in their designs, and these colors should go together well, as was the case in those just mentioned. Next, I want the Legendaries to be based off animals or mythical creatures that are interesting. This is a bit abstract in general and probably difficult to grasp, so let me give some examples. Regigigas is an example of a legendary that isn't really based off anything interesting. You look at it and you say, that doesn't really look like a very cool creature. Zygarde and Heatran suffer from a similar fate, and the Lake Trio, despite how much I love them, aren't all that stunning purely as creatures. Compare these Pokemon to beasts like Lugia, Rayquaza, Yveltal, and Giratina. It's just not the same level of epicness. Again, this is very vague and abstract since it's hard to be objective with design related matters, but I want for the Legendaries of Sun and Moon to be interesting creatures. And don't mistake this as me saying their designs should be overly complicated. There are ways of keeping a design simple while at the same time interesting to look at. If Game Freak took these design suggestions into account, I think it would help a lot for the Legendaries of Sun and Moon. Well, alright folks, that is pretty much gonna do it for this video. As always, if you enjoyed, be sure to drop me a like down below, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more Pokemon Sun and Moon videos in the future. And of course, be sure to let me know your thoughts on what I said in this video. Do you agree or disagree with what I said for the most part, and do you think I left anything major out? Otherwise, I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video.